There's a crop that fed more people on less land, with less labor, than almost anything else humans have ever cultivated. It grew in climates where other staples struggled. It produced massive yields without depleting the soil. And for thousands of years, entire civilizations relied on it as their primary food source. Then, in less than a century, we almost entirely stopped growing it. Not because it stopped working, not because we found something better, but because the system changed, and this crop didn't fit the new rules. If you've been following this series, you've seen duckweed, the protein source we dismiss as pond scum, breadfruit, the tree that feeds families for 50 years, spirulina, the fastest growing protein on Earth, and clover, the plant every farm once relied on. Every one of those challenged a piece of how we think about food. But this one challenges the entire concept of agricultural efficiency itself. Because what if the most efficient food we've ever grown is something we barely plant anymore? Stay with me. Let's talk numbers. Efficiency in agriculture usually gets measured in yield per acre. How much food can you squeeze out of a given piece of land? By that metric, modern industrial crops do pretty well. Corn, for instance, can produce around 180 bushels per acre under optimal conditions. Rice in highly managed paddies might yield 7,000 to 8,000 pounds per acre. These are impressive numbers. They represent decades of selective breeding, heavy fertilization, and intensive management. But there's one crop that, under traditional low-input farming methods, could produce 20 tons per acre. Not 2 tons, 20. And that's not the record. In ideal conditions, yields could push even higher. Some historical accounts document harvests exceeding 30 tons per acre. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 6 to 10 times the caloric yield of wheat or rice on the same amount of land, with far less labor, no plowing, and no annual replanting. Cassava is a root vegetable native to South America, though it now grows across the tropics in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It looks unassuming, a woody shrub with long tuberous roots that grow underground, similar in appearance to a sweet potato, but larger and denser. The roots are pure starch, high in carbohydrates, low in protein, not much in the way of micronutrients. And because of that nutritional profile, cassava gets dismissed in conversations about superfoods or optimal nutrition. But here's what that misses. Cassava wasn't grown to be a complete food. It was grown to be an efficient calorie source, the foundation that allowed communities to meet their energy needs so they could grow or gather everything else. Think of it like this. If your goal is to feed a population, you need calories first. Protein, vitamins, and minerals matter. But if you can't meet baseline caloric needs, nothing else works. Cassava solved the calorie problem better than almost any crop in human history. In regions where it thrived, cassava freed up land and labor for protein-rich crops, for vegetables, for animals. It was the base of the food pyramid that made everything else possible. And it did this with almost no inputs. You plant a cutting. It grows for 8 to 24 months, depending on the variety. You harvest the roots. The plant regenerates from what's left in the ground. No seeds to buy, no annual plowing, minimal water. It grows in acidic soils where other crops fail. It's drought-tolerant, pest-resistant in many regions, can be left in the ground for months after maturity, acting as storage. From a purely efficiency standpoint, calories produced per unit of labor and land, cassava is hard to beat. So why isn't it feeding the world? Here's the part that made cassava incompatible with modern industrial agriculture. It's perishable. Once you harvest cassava roots, they start degrading within 24 to 48 hours. The starches break down. The roots become woody, unpalatable, or even toxic if improperly stored. This wasn't a problem in traditional systems. You harvested what you needed when you needed it. The roots stayed in the ground, a living pantry, until you were ready to eat them. But it's a massive problem for industrial food systems built around centralized processing, long-distance shipping, commodity storage, global trade. You can't warehouse cassava like wheat. You can't ship it across oceans like corn. You can't store it for years like rice. It has to be processed quickly, dried into flour, fermented, or turned into products like tapioca, or eaten fresh within days. That makes it local, tied to where it grows, dependent on immediate use or on-site processing. And modern agriculture doesn't reward local. It rewards scalable. In the mid-20th century, as global agriculture industrialized, The crops that succeeded were the ones that fit the system. Grains that could be mechanically harvested, stored indefinitely, and shipped globally. Crops that tolerated monoculture, that responded well to synthetic fertilizers, that could be planted and harvested on precise schedules. Cassava didn't check those boxes. It's harvested by hand. The roots are underground and fragile. It doesn't store well post-harvest. It's too region-specific, too tied to local food cultures to become a global commodity like wheat or corn. So investment shifted. Research funding went to industrial crops. Infrastructure was built for grains. Markets standardized around what could be traded internationally. And cassava? It stayed in the tropics, feeding over 800 million people, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's a staple, but largely invisible to global agricultural policy and investment. Here's what's wild about that. Cassava still produces more calories per acre, with less labor and fewer inputs, than most of the crops we prioritize. But because it doesn't fit the commodity model, it's treated as a subsistence crop, a term that, in agricultural economics, is often code for not worth scaling. The implication is that cassava is somehow backward, primitive, something people grow because they don't have access to modern options. But what if we got that backward? What if cassava represents a model of efficiency that industrial agriculture can't match precisely because it doesn't require the industrial inputs that make other crops profitable for agribusiness? Here's the thing that gets me. We live in an era where we're obsessed with optimizing everything. We want maximum output, minimum waste, lowest cost. And yet, we've structured our food system around crops that require massive machinery, synthetic fertilizers, herbicides and pesticides, irrigation infrastructure, long supply chains, controlled storage. Meanwhile, cassava just grows. With almost none of that. It's not that cassava is perfect. It's not. The perishability is real. The low protein content means it needs to be part of a diversified diet, not a monoculture itself. But it forces a question we've been avoiding. What if efficiency isn't about maximizing yield in a controlled system, but about minimizing the inputs required to meet needs? Because by that definition, cassava might be one of the most efficient crops humans have ever domesticated. It asks almost nothing. It gives an enormous amount. And it does so in conditions where other crops struggle. The problem isn't the crop. It's that we built a food system that can't accommodate it. Here's what most people don't realize. Cassava isn't some relic of the past. It's currently the third most important source of carbohydrates in the tropics, after rice and maize. Over 800 million people rely on it as a primary food source. In countries facing climate instability, drought, and soil degradation, cassava is often what keeps people fed when other crops fail. It's not celebrated. It doesn't make headlines. It's not researched at the same level as corn or wheat. But it works. And as climate change makes agriculture more unpredictable, as droughts become more common, as soil quality declines, as water becomes scarcer, crops like cassava that thrive under stress are starting to look less primitive and more resilient. Some researchers are even revisiting cassava, exploring biofortification to increase its vitamin A and protein content, improved processing techniques to extend shelf life. So let's come back to the original question. What's the most efficient food humans ever grew? If you define efficiency as yield per acre in an industrial system, cassava doesn't win. But if you define efficiency as calories produced per unit of labor and input under real-world conditions over time, cassava is hard to beat. It doesn't need perfect soil. It doesn't need much water. It doesn't need replanting every year. It doesn't need pesticides or synthetic nitrogen. It just needs to be planted once, in a climate it tolerates, and it will produce food for years. The inefficiency isn't in the crop. The inefficiency is in a system that can't handle food that isn't designed for global commodity trade. And maybe, just maybe, that's what we need to rethink. Not the crop, the system.